Hello, welcome back. This is lecture 15. We have one more lecture after this. So for the present, we turn our attention to mainland Southeast Asia. This region, along with Sri Lanka, is still one of the most active Buddhist sites in our contemporary world. It is the main home for what has been referred to previously as Reformed Theravada. In one way, the spread of the Buddhist tradition along the island Southeast Asia route was dominated by ties back to India. The current Reformed Theravada, found in mainland Southeast Asia, has stronger links to Sri Lanka. While the shifting trade and cultural developments in island Southeast Asia over time diminished the importance or even the presence of Buddhism, the same cannot be said for the mainland. Emerging kingdoms with central authority and royal courts, large capital cities serving as fixed abodes for the rulers, boundaries that were known and defended, were quite different from the earlier period of multiple political mandalas. When commercial networks shifted from Buddhism and Brahmanic followers, even the large communities of the two traditions were left without a strong support base, and Islam came into dominance. The fact that Reformed Theravada could survive and thrive on the mainland shows us that there were distinctly different forces at play compared to those associated with the islands. While mainland Southeast Asia is now one of the areas that has maintained close ties to Buddhism, the study of how the tradition developed for this region is complicated and still lacking a clear historical method. This map gives us some rough spatial views of the ever-changing political entities of the mainland Southeast Asia. We see the Pyu in the eastern region and the Dvaravati to the east, followed by the triad of Funan, Champa, and Chinla. In the previous lecture, we outlined the Buddhist movement through the sea lanes, including both mainland Southeast Asia and island Southeast Asia. As the tradition moved east and north across the mainland, it came into contact with the two empires, identified in Chinese records as Champa and Funan. These two political units were in the borders of central and southern Vietnam and eastern Cambodia. Now, our view of what is now Vietnam must take into account that the present nation-state boundaries that extend all the way from the Chinese border to the Mekong Delta were not under the domination of the Viet people prior to the 15th century. As maritime Buddhism made its way to China from the 3rd century onward, it would be a mistake to consider the coastal areas at that time, from Mekong Delta to the Central Coast, as Vietnam. There were a number of other ethnic groups that occupied the route and ruled these coastal enclaves. The two regions and groupings of people known as the Champa and Funan empires depend on Chinese documents for their earliest histories. It's through the lens of the Chinese documents that we have a historical record of the two. Many scholars now assert that the Chinese views of these entities was mistakenly based on their own structure of empire. That is, a central governing group with a hereditary reign in some residential format for the royal family. Now, the documentation of visits and encounters between the envoys of China and the people of these settlements was seen by the Chinese as contact with kingdoms similar to their own. The identification of the region known as Chinle is even more murky in terms of its history. When the Chinese envoys thought of being in Funan, what was their idea of its mapping? As you note in this slide, our current literature draws a great variety of depictions of Funan. This is an example of why we need to be very careful when looking at solid colored maps with boundaries marked by color. If we consider the case of Champa, this view of an established empire that was dependent on a royal house for its identity does not match any of our available data. The Champa people have an ancient history as Austronesian speakers who came to the shores of central Vietnam many centuries ago. The archaeological record is still without a clear focus. Once the Chinese conceived of the empires for Funan, Champa, and Chinle, they could imagine events taking place based on the boundaries and the governance of these empires. For example, they declared that Funan had been overrun by the armies of Chinle in the 6th century, and thus a new empire was constructed in the literature. The successors to the Funan territory were known as Chinle Water, compared to the rest of the region that came to be identified by the Chinese as Chinle Land. So how are we to study Buddhism in terms of this interpretation of our sparse documentation for empire history of mainland Southeast Asia? Now, the envoy visits from China reported that Chinle Land was a stable government, while Chinle Water was subject to changes and open to influences from Java. Our data for the study of Chinle is most often dependent on archaeological artifacts that were used to mark the extent of the empire. However, the presence of Buddhist artifacts does not in itself tell us that the existence of these finds can be matched with political boundaries. As we know, cultural features can spread far and wide, indicating patterns of assimilation and response to context. These works of art and fragments of architecture give a picture of the primary importance of the Indian Brahmanic tradition rather than Buddhism. In other words, both Brahmanism and Buddhism existed side by side in mainland Southeast Asia, as they also did in Java and Sumatra. the two religious traditions of India were difficult to separate in terms of the practices and the support of the followers. Populations were involved to some degree with both and did not feel it necessary to identify with only one religious practice. In Java, the Borobudur complex is an example of how monumental structures could be placed next to one another that represented the two differing religious heritages from India. For many in these regions, it was not necessary to have a unitary religious belief. The shrines, inscriptions, monuments, and architecture show us various formations of Brahmanic, Buddhist, and local popular cults existing simultaneously, and this in both mainland and island Southeast Asia. People were often involved with all three, and they didn't consider it a problem. Returning to our discussion of Champa, historians have in the past asserted that the group expanded into an empire that lasted until the Vietnamese people, in their push southward, conquered the major port called Srivijaya in the 15th century and effectively ended the existence of the political entity. Now, it may be a bit confusing to speak of the port of Srivijaya with the same name as that given to the island Southeast Asia Confederation known as Srivijaya Empire. It is the same name, but for two very different types of places. The question now being debated is whether it's appropriate to call these groups of settlements along the coasts of Vietnam and Cambodia as empires. It's probably much more accurate to see these so-called empires as multiple mandala settlements ruled by local leaders. While our slideshow shows the two in solid colored maps, it's doubtful that this gives a true view of the situation. For example, we can say there were a number of political mandala centers for the Austronesian language speakers. To say that the mandalas were united under a central ruling family is now under serious question. The Chinese, having considered the settlements as an empire with, quote, Sri Vijaya as the capital, could document the end of the empire when that city was captured by the Dai Viets moving south. However, many of the Champa settlements, particularly maritime centers, continued to exist centuries after the Viet people arrived. And they were able to have their own direct relationship with China and even the Ryukyus up to the 18th century. This reality is displayed in the map by providing space for later Champa. Well, rather than a single government for Champa, we have strong indications of multiple units of ethnic groups that were loose confederations. The networks were interactive systems, and a map of their activity would be more like a lace pattern than the solid color. Now, these Champa settlements occupied an important role as coastal entrepôts, connecting China and the sea routes leading back to Sumatra and the Strait of Malacca. While only traces of Buddhism have been found in the region, Buddhist artifacts are used as proof. For a time, Buddhism was a major influence. From inscriptional evidence, it would appear to have been some form of Tantra with aspects of older Mahayana ideas. We can perhaps better understand this form of Buddhism by looking at Palembang in Sumatra, which was a crucial center for pilgrims on their way to India. It was in Palembang that Atisha received his training in Tantra, combined, as he describes it, with perfection of wisdom, Prajna Paramita, texts of Mahayana. If the Champa were not Vietnamese, who were they? From the language they used, it's now established they were Austronesian speakers, using a non-Han Chinese language that was oral, without a written form. Now, the descendants of these people are still to be found in Vietnam. So-called tribal groups in the mountains along the western borders. Their language is very different from Vietnamese. And so we find their radios turn to Manila, where Maleo-Polynesian language, a subgroup of Austronesia, is spoken. Well, as with a number of issues we have discussed, the histories of Champa and Funan are lacking significant documentation. The difficulty of identifying Funan can be seen in looking once again at the map shown above. As I just indicated, there is no agreement on what Funan meant. Was it only in Cambodia and the Mekong Delta? Or did it extend over much of Thailand and extend down the peninsula into Malaysia? Well, even less can be documented with Chenla. While Chinese governing bodies wanted to believe in an empire that acknowledged the supremacy of the Central Kingdom, their contacts were limited to a few mandala centers. Remember that the idea of political mandalas meant local self-governing groups that were not part of a dynastic rule from a central capital. The ways in which each of these mandalas functioned in terms of legal and social arrangements were multiple and complex. The tagging of an area as mandala is not a nuanced description of a regional practice. We can now turn again to island Southeast Asia. For equivalent empires to Funan and Champa, for mainland Buddhism, island East Asia had two identified zones: Sri Vijaya, that covered Malaysia and much of Indonesia, and Shailendra, that arose in Bali and had ports and some control of parts of Borneo and Sulawesi. Buddhist artifacts and monuments from Java are well known. Those from Borneo and Sulawesi are few in number, but it is of note to point out that the easternmost evidence of Buddhist presence in the Pacific Islands is on the southern coast of Sulawesi. Srivijaya sites and events have been described previously, especially the importance of Palembang and Sumatra. In terms of time, the Srivijaya area was active from the 7th to the 12th centuries, while Shailendra was a much shorter time of the 8th to the 9th centuries, and its major site was Borobudur. As a bit of review, our categories of Buddhist practice are multiple. There was early Buddhism, the emergence of written texts that are identified as Mahayana, ritual developments that extended the teachings of the Mahayana texts to include empowerment exercises known as Tantra, reforms that resulted from series of councils among monastics led to reformed Theravada. At the same time, Buddhism in all its formations was often put in partnership with Brahmanic priestly approaches. In addition, wherever the tradition established bases of practice, it also stood together with local popular beliefs about spirits and chthonic powers. All these formations in a complex maze of interactions and connections operated with the Buddhism found in both island Southeast Asia and mainland Southeast Asia. The task of historians is to identify the spatial and temporal expressions of Buddhism. We've already discussed the artwork found in the carved panels of Borobudur. The size, the sophistication of Buddhist and Brahmanic structures at the site give us some indication of the power and the appeal of Buddhism by the turn of the 9th century. The Khmer Empire, that is, we're talking now about the 9th to the 15th century, that is on the mainland Southeast Asia at the time of the building of Borobudur, that is around 800 in Java. The Khmer people became a major force in the political as well as the cultural aspects of the region. A typical description of the expanding base of the Khmer is shown in this map. They were considered to be rulers of large portions of mainland Southeast Asia, extending down the Malay Peninsula and into Myanmar, as well as Cambodia and parts of Vietnam. In this map, the Khmer are shown as controlling most of mainland Southeast Asia, extending eastward to the coastal regions where the peoples of the Viet and the Champa remained independent. The Khmer and the Angkor areas can be considered in two ways. They represented hinterland culture and society for the ports at the Mekong Delta and the northern Malaysian Peninsula. And at the same time, they were deeply involved with the interior of mainland Southeast Asia. This fact is shown by the construction of roads that branched out in multiple directions. A particular note is that some of the roads were enhanced by the construction of stone bridges, crossing the many large and small streams that drained the local landscape. Trade flowed along these roads and gave financial substance to the Khmer rulers. Well, future research is needed to establish how these raised roadways with stone bridge interacted with the seaports. All of this data on roads, bridges, ports, trade, helped to establish that the flow of influence between mainland Southeast Asia and island Southeast Asia was active. Angkor Wat, deep in the hinterland, and Borobudur, strategically located away from the coast, were still part of maritime Buddhism, which brought Indian and Chinese cultural patterns and material objects to the shores of mainland Southeast Asia. Well, I hope that a lecture with so many maps has not given you the impression that maritime Buddhism can only be discussed by reference to empires. Buddhism was a part of the cultural matrix of both mainland Southeast Asia as well as island Southeast Asia. These mappings were an integral part of history of Buddhism as it made its way eastward toward China. In the last lecture of the course, we will take that journey to East Asia. Thank you very much.